Good morning. My name's Trevor Hutton. I'm the officiating minister at Fenton Church of Nazarene. Once a week on a Monday, I do this little reflection called Musings on a Monday, which integrates faith with a real life story or a real life situation, maybe something in the news, something in popular culture. You can check out on our Facebook page some of the other Musings on a Monday. So I think lots have gone on this week, but primarily there's been a lot said about politics. And I don't want to do that again because I talked about politics a few weeks ago. But I was thinking about the significance of what's going on across our nation, with various regional governments, mayoral elections, local council elections, and of course, the important governmental elections in returning, members of Parliament, essentially to the Welsh and to the Scottish assemblies. So big days, and we're not sure what's going to happen as a result of all of the realignment of politics and some tricky times ahead as a country, as various issues are navigated, post-COVID world, and also what it means for the United Kingdom to be the United Kingdom and what that looks like in different regions, and various views as to the best way people should be governed or govern themselves, etc., etc., etc. But actually, I was caught by a story that was kind of not dominant in the press, but relates particularly to today's date, which is about the 10th of May, and it reflects the celebration, the anniversary, when Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa in 1994. And so there are a number of papers or news outlets are just reflecting on what a remarkable situation this was in such a divided and a troublesome situation in his own loved country of South Africa, where people wouldn't be able to get on. There was racial segregation. There was lots of things for the apartheid system that were just keeping people apart. So therefore, bitterness and anger was part of the life that was experienced because of all that was going on different sides, and atrocities and harm and hurt and oppression and imprisonment. Of course, if you know the story of Mandela himself, he famously was imprisoned in South Africa, particularly in Rhode Island, for a period of 27 years. And what's interesting, if you read his story, if you watch movies like, Invictus or Long Road to Freedom, or read anything about him, he wrestled with what it would mean if he was ever freed, what sort of life he would live, if he was ever given any political forum or just worked in civic society. How would he conduct himself in the light of his own, if you like, persecution, in his own experience of being in prison for such a long time, in solitary confinement for long periods of that, as people were campaigning for him and for his release. So what's interesting to me is what Mandela did as he thought about a broken society and a broken country, and how if he got a chance to do something about it, what attitude he could take. And it was easy for him to take an attitude of revenge for all that happened to him personally. But one of the things that Mandela said as he went out from that final day in prison, when he was released, by de Klerk, who worked with him to try and create a new future for South Africa, what Mandela called the Rainbow Nation, of bringing people together and overcoming the difficulties and experiences of devastation that each community had suffered, to create a place where everyone could aspirationally be equal and share in the future of their society. He kind of said this as he was walking out of the prison door for the last time. He said, as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead me to freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. Think about that. I'm going to read that again. As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead me to my freedom, I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. What he recognized was that revenge was the enemy of freedom. What he recognized that revenge, though tempted to engage in retaliation or holding grudges or not granting forgiveness, that actually what that would do would create an imprisonment that was perhaps far greater than even the imprisonment in which he physically experienced being in jail. That there's something about the imprisonment of our own soul and the imprisonment of our own lives when we do not forgive others, even as we have been forgiven. The forgiveness somehow sets us free, and not forgiving not only puts another person in prison, but also puts us in our own prisons. In Mandela's, therefore, actions, what he sought to do as he became president was to bring reconciliation to people that were arch enemies, to bring people together. The act of reconciliation was manifested primarily when he asked Desmond Tutu to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And the idea about that was that people would name the very bad things that had happened. They would name their losses. They would name the things that happened to them and their communities that weren't good. But in naming truth and facing perpetrators who had inflicted this upon people's families, they were able to be set free by at least moving towards a desire to grant forgiveness and work towards reconciliation. Though the commission was very difficult, and what was done in that commission was heartbreaking for so many people, it not only brought closure to many families and truth about what had happened to loved ones, but it gave an opportunity to let go. And Mandela modelled this in all of his presidency, reaching out to the white Afrikaans in every way in order that he could demonstrate through his own life that releasing others was the way in which everyone could be free. Mandela was influenced by a number of writers, including Gandhi, and inspired by people like Martin Luther King, who didn't want violent revolution, but sought to love one another. But he was also primarily influenced by the teaching of Jesus, where Jesus would often talk about, revenge is something that actually puts everyone in prison. And a couple of quotes that I like is, just want to close with this, where he says, resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. He says, forgiveness liberates the soul. It removes fear. That's why it's such a powerful weapon. He says, reconciliation does not mean forgetting or trying to bury the pain of conflict, but that reconciliation means working together to correct the legacy of past injustice. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. He says, no one is born hating another person because of the colour of his skin or his background or his religion. They must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposites. At the heart of the Christian faith is the story of reconciliation, God's reconciliation with his creation, where through the death of Christ, he brings kind of warring parties together in order that everyone might have freedom and might know liberation and love again. And Jesus, when he was on earth, he taught his followers that they too were to model the great reconciliatory act of God in the atonement, that they were to also love their enemies, to turn the other cheek, which seemed like impossible things to do and could only be done through the grace and power of God working within us. But in so doing, it breaks the cycle of revenge. One of my favourite stories you could look up if you're ever interested in the Bible, in Matthew chapter 19, tells a story where one of the disciples of Jesus said, how many times should I forgive someone who wrongs me? And this was a disciple called Peter, and he suggested that, he could forgive someone up to 7 times for the same offence. And actually, in Jesus' day, the rabbis taught if you forgive someone 3 times for an offense, you were doing really well. So Peter was thinking he was doing amazingly well by doubling the number. And so, he was thinking, wow, look at me, Jesus, I'm willing to go 7 times. Then Jesus tells him, not 7 times, Peter, but 77 times. And he tells a story about someone who was forgiven a great big debt. And he goes to the king and he begs for mercy that his debt would be cancelled. Against all the odds, the king cancels an enormous debt that was unrepayable. It was like a massive debt that could never be repaid. It was like the equivalent of the whole taxation income of Jerusalem. I mean, he was never going to pay them out that, and the king mercifully sets him free. And then what happens is that person who's set free is owed a couple of pennies by someone who has caused a debt to be put against his name. And rather than exercising mercy, he actually asks for this person to also be put in prison until he can find, the few pence that would pay him back. The greater debt that was unbelievable was forgiven by the king, which represents God in the picture, and the lesser debt was not forgiven, that something hadn't happened in this man's heart, that he could forgive someone else a wrong done against him in the light of the many ways in which God had forgiven him. So Jesus kind of answers Peter's question by saying, Peter, it's not just like counting the number of times you forgive. It's more like living a life where you don't engage in continual revenge, and that you actually live in a way that sets others free. So today, as we think about that story, then through the grace and power of God, we can learn how to live in a way that means that we are free from the debt that God wants to forgive us, and being forgiven by our friends, our loved ones, by God himself for the number of times we've done wrong, that we can also be able to offer that to other people who might actually, sin or owe a debt to us in maybe even some smaller way, that the grace that we receive from others is passed on to others, and we break the cycles of revenge. So on this day, I can celebrate Nelson Mandela. I celebrate many of the things that he stood up for. I celebrate his desire to not hold bitterness at his own heart for his enemies, but to release his enemies from their wrongdoing. Jesus said, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Today I'm challenged, and challenged greatly, to make sure I've not got a heart that is wanting to imprison others. Because when I imprison others by withholding forgiveness, I find too easily, as Mandela says, that I continue to live in my own prison. So may God help us today as we think about this significant day in history, about a great man who let people live a different way and encourage them to break the cycles of revenge, that we too in our own lives would grant forgiveness to others for the debts they owe us, even as we ask others and God to forgive us for our debts. Let's not live in prisons. Let's free others. And in so freeing others, we too become free. I'll see you next Monday.